אני שמח לראות אולם מלא וקהל צמא, ואני מברך אתכם בעברית וההמשך יהיה באנגלית. אני מבקש להזמין את פרופסור אילון ועדיה, ראש מרכז אדמונד ולילי ספרא למדעי המוח. בבקשה אילון.
Good evening, ערב טוב. We'll switch to English in respect of our honored guest tonight. And tonight, or this week, actually, we celebrate very good future for all of us. The future of understanding the brain. And we will understand the brain. I believe that those of you who watched the presentation by students, who listened to the lectures here, can grasp the sense of excitement that we have in our center and in Israel and in the world. Obama will visit shortly, talks about a huge plan for brain sciences. The European talks about huge plan for brain sciences. And we, with our small, smart Israel, we also have huge plans for brain sciences. And one of these plans, and today we will talk about the plan to have a new home for brain sciences at the Hebrew University. And this new home is being planned for the last 2 years or so by Foster and partners. Two of them you see here, Lord Foster and Professor Spencer de Gray, who sits here with us and will deliver the talk soon. As you can see, Spencer is already at home here in Israel, sitting and chatting with our president about the possible projects that the company will continue to have in Israel in the next 20 years or so. But for now, they have two projects. One is the Brain Science Center building, and the second is the Einstein home that will also be built by the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Spencer has started his work many years ago. I lost my paper, so I can't remember all the details. No, I do have it. I'm joking. So he started his way a long time ago, studying architecture at the Cambridge University, and then joined the Foster Associate at the time. Now it's called Foster Plus Partners. In 1973, then he spent time in Hong Kong, building this building that you see here now, a bank in Hong Kong, and then returned to London where he designed. He was in the chief of design of these several projects that I cannot count. Enormous number of projects. This is the airport in London. This is the BBC Radio Center in London, and something that many of you might have seen, the Great Court of the British Museum, a really fascinating architecture combining the new and the old. And this is what it's all about, combining the new and the old, not destroying the past and looking to the future. This is what we are about in our brain center. And here you see Darren, who is right here, together with Spencer and Perez, talking about the new buildings at the Hebrew University. And I would be very happy to share with you the delight that we have in having this new building that Spencer will shortly tell you about. With this, I would like to invite you, Spencer, to tell us stories about architecture, the brain, and the future.
Good evening. It's an incredible privilege to be here this evening. I'm absolutely no expert on the brain. This evening is in two parts. First of all, I'm going to give what I hope is a relatively short introduction to the new brain center here in Jerusalem, with some other examples which fit into the context that Eilon has just very well outlined in terms of history, culture, and research, which are three things that have interested the practice really since the practice was founded. And I'll try and give some clues to that. And then that's to be followed by some questions and answers, and then the film about Norman Foster, which I think does give you an insight into a particular individual's brain. I hope that you will get under the skin, under the hair, not the hair, under the head of Norman later this evening. I think it's a very fascinating film. So just to start, one of the other universities that we have worked with is Imperial College in the middle of London, the heart of Prince Albert's great vision for this part of London to be the coming together. I mean, he was an incredibly far-sighted individual. This idea of bringing art and science and technology together under one roof in one part of London after the 1851 exhibition was an extraordinary vision, and we've worked with Imperial over many years, going back to 1989. And one of the more recent projects we've done for them was their main entrance linked to a management school, and I don't intend to talk about that at any length, other than at the entrance to this building, which is also the entrance to Imperial College as a university, as a complex of buildings, we created with Per Arnoldi this image based on the brain to represent the extraordinary intellect of Imperial College as one of the world's leading universities. So our fascination with the brain, although I have to stress this is superficial rather than in any depth, goes back some years. And our first building for Imperial was a medical research building, not a brain research building particularly, but a medical research building, which was breaking new ground for Imperial. It brought together three different departments, one from hospitals and two of the university departments themselves, into one building. So you had in this building a group of people who'd never really met each other before. And in all the work that we've done in university buildings, and particularly medical research buildings, it's trying to break down the barriers that we feel very passionately about. So instead of putting everybody into little separate cells, which is the norm in many research buildings, we wanted to open the building up, to make people aware of each other, to bump into each other as they moved around this very grand space at the heart of the research laboratories, so that everybody was aware of each other, that they talked to each other informally, as well as working on their particular projects. And the feedback that we get from Imperial has been very positive. Suddenly, new things have become possible through these chance meetings and discussions. So you can see here this grand atrium space, top lit, and it only has one real elevation, and that faces north. So we were anxious through the top lights in our northerly climate to get sun into that space. And instead of putting all the write-up spaces in the laboratories, tucked away, we brought all the write-up spaces out into the atrium, and we combined those with the carrels, which you can see at the base of the atrium, as part of a huge, I mean, almost like a medieval library, a large working space, with the laboratories almost secondary in terms of their importance in the space. And then if you turn around through 90 degrees, you can see, as it were, the back wall. And again, working with Per Arnoldi, who had worked with us on the brain image some years later, the use of very strong colour to bring life and light and excitement to this grand research space. And here you can see the tiered carrels for the PhD students stepping down, terracing down. And on the very left-hand side, you can just see a tiny triangle of the glazed floor that looks down into the undergraduate world, which exists below this elevated research space. And here you can see the roof form, which was designed, as I said, to get sunlight into the space, to bring light and variation into what was almost an internal courtyard. And at the same time as we were working for Imperial College, we were also working at Stanford University in California, where we were asked to look at another medical research building, the first in 2 medical research buildings that we did for them. And I think this touches on an issue that always fascinates us and has been very central to the work we've been doing here at the at the university here in Jerusalem, which is not only looking at the building itself, but looking at the context of a building. If you build a new building, it ripples out. The impact of that building has a connotation, moves out to a wider context. And I think the sort of master plan that can emanate from looking at a new building is again something that fascinates us. And so the first building that we looked at was the CCSR building, as it's called. Again, a medical research on 3 floors that became the generator of a master plan with its roots linking to other parts of the university. And at the heart of this building is a through route, which is protected from the sun with the shading which you can see. But in California, of course, it's open to the climate. There's no climate protection other than the shading. And this is a through route, but it's also a social space where people can gather and sit and have a cup of coffee and meet their colleagues and discuss. And I think in our experience as creative people, these informal sessions are as important as the sort of formal research that goes on within the building. And then you can see the curved bay windows, which are the spaces, not the laboratory spaces, but the write-up spaces, with the laboratory spaces behind, as you can see here. And these are the write-up meeting office spaces that look back down into that route. So there's a close link between a through route and people working inside the building. And then the second building, which was part of the wider master plan that I referred to a few minutes ago, was the Clark Center, a very different building in its feel, using curves, more organic in its form. And by this time, the thinking at Stanford had moved on in terms of medical research, and they wanted something that was far more flexible. And at the heart of the building, again, is a gathering space where people can come together, but not the same as the first building, quite different in its feel, a bigger space for bigger gatherings. So the two work together. And then within the building, not fixed laboratory spaces, but very flexible spaces where pieces of furniture can move, where services are dropped down from the ceiling, so that the configuration of different research groups can change over time as the demand requires it. And if I then move to Cambridge University, a very different form of building, this building earlier than the three I've just talked about, the law faculty, which is part of the Sidgwick site, the arts campus, just on the outskirts of the centre of Cambridge, where a number of architects over the years have contributed. Hugh Casson, James Sterling on the right, and then more recently ourselves. And this represents the entrance moving into a rather grand, but actually quite economical in terms of its footprint, entrance hall, where the curved space joins the floors of the library with an express staircase that takes you up to the various floors of the library. And then as you move up the building, you come to the library itself, where all the reading areas are pulled to the edge of the building with views out over the garden, and the books are stored away from the natural light underneath the terraces of the building itself. But again, trying to integrate the whole spatial experience as one, with the lecture rooms at below ground at the lower level, but all part of one volume. There's no separation. And you can see here the building by night, the enclosed glass form with the tiers of library floors terracing back. We've also worked in education on many other projects. The first project I ever worked with Norman in the office was a school in Liverpool, and that school tradition has extended particularly recently with a number of city academies, and we've done 9 of those, which I just show here as just a synopsis of our fascination and interest and involvement in education in all its different forms. But just then linking education and art and culture together, one of our earlier projects, the Sainsbury Centre at the University of East Anglia in the eastern part of the UK, sitting on a campus designed by Dennis Lasdon, and you can just see behind the reeds on the right his residential buildings, very strong concrete buildings, very much of their era at the end of the 1960s, beginning of the 1970s. And then an offer by the Sainsbury family to give their collection, a wonderful collection of art, to the university, linked to a number of university functions like the Department of the History of Art, the Senior Common Room, and so on. So a building that combines education and culture in a very interesting way. And because when this was all started as the brainchild of the Sainsbury family, we were all uncertain about how this might develop over time, the idea of a very flexible enclosure, a big span building, generous in height, a great deal of natural light coming from above, that would allow the university and the Sainsbury family to develop the interior layout over time. And as I will show, this indeed has happened. And then a concept that we have become very attached to in the office, the idea of a communal living room. Be that, in this case, for the university, where students, and you can see some of them sitting on the floor, can come in a very informal way and sit amongst this extraordinary collection of art, which includes some of the greatest Francis Bacon paintings that exist. Or whether it's an urban living room where the general public come in a relaxed and informal way and enjoy a space. The theme of a living room is something that we very much enjoy developing in different contexts, and is highly relevant to the project here in Jerusalem. And you can see the Bacon on the right, the Degas dancer, the Giacometti. It gives you an indication of the quality of what is within the building. But all of this within this overall enclosure that allows that flexibility, that informality to exist. And you can see here the many different activities. There's a public restaurant. There are 2 mezzanines which include offices with the Senior Common Room above, the Department of the History of Art on the right. All within, treated all equally within that space. That was phase 1. The most flattering thing that can ever happen to an architect is to be invited back to do another piece of work. And several years later, the Sainsbury family wanted to expand the building to include research and a black box exhibition space and offices. And of course, we thought the obvious thing was just to expand the building. But they returned and said, no, that was out of the question. They liked the big building just as it was. They didn't want any change. We had to think again. And so we developed the idea of extending the floor, as it were, of the main building out as a grass terrace, and literally digging the new extension below ground, with the sole exception of this eyebrow of glass which lights the offices and the principal circulation. So here you can see before the building opened, that eyebrow inside with all the offices moved away from the glass wall, looking onto that space, and they have a view down to the lake that I showed you right at the beginning. And then there is the reserve collection, there is the laboratory space for research and restoration of works of art, all contained in this below ground space. And you can see the circular disc, which brings a limited amount of top light into the laboratory space. We thought that was it. No, the Sainsbury family are amazing. The entrance to the crescent wing, which I've just shown you, was separate. It was outside the building. And they were worried. They thought there ought to be a direct link between the main building and the facilities in the crescent wing. So the third phase was to look at linking the two together below ground. And this is the opening party for the third phase, which also included upgrading the building, which is now over 30 years old. And you can see here how we extended the staircase, put in a new elevator to a lower level shop that then links through via a gallery to those existing spaces. And I think in a way, the work on the Sainsbury Centre set a pattern of how we approach cultural buildings, and I think many of our buildings over the years. But then linked to that is how buildings work in a historic context. And our first work with a historic building was at the Royal Academy. You're looking through the arch off Piccadilly. The Academy is incredibly well located. And you can see what was Burlington House. And Burlington House was built in the 1750s. But when the Royal Academy moved to Burlington House in the 1860s, they had no worries about adding a whole new floor to the top of the original Palladian house. So the top floor of what you're looking at is 1860, the rest is 1750. And in the top floor, there were a series of very small galleries that were totally impossible to use because they had glass roofs and they just had too much heat in the summer. They were too cold in the winter. The condensation poured down the walls. They were unusable. But the Academy wanted a suite of small galleries. And I think this is where the story begins. We did a very painstaking amount of research. And you can see, looking down on the aerial view, you can see the courtyard in the front, and then you can see the roof of Burlington House, the red line, which I'll come to in a minute, and at the back is part of the main galleries that were built in 1862. And when they built the new building in 1860, they left a 4-metre gap between the historic Burlington House and the new galleries. And I think that was very sensible in construction terms. And that tiny space became the clue to a bigger master plan for the Royal Academy. Because when Arthur and Jill Sackler gave money for the project, they said that just doing the environmental conditions for 3 galleries was just not grand enough. They wanted to put their name to something bigger and grander. And that led us to looking at the wider picture and how you moved vertically in the Royal Academy, which was not very satisfactory. And you can see here that 4-metre gap. And the quality of the architecture of both Burlington House on the right and the main galleries on the left was very interesting. But over the years, people had used this space to put lavatories, storage, to dump whatever they couldn't find space for, they put in this space. And if you just follow the history of this little window here, which is an original 1810 window, what we were able to do is to take all the stuff out of the space, all the stuff that was not of any interest architecturally or historically, and reveal the hidden elevation of the original Burlington House, which no one had seen for 130 years. Now, when we came to do that, some of it was in good condition, particularly the bit, as you can see, beyond the new elevator. Some of it had to be restored. And then into that space, we added new elements, a new lift, a new staircase, and very importantly, an upper level that was the new entrance to these small galleries. But I think it shows, and we began to develop this philosophy at the Royal Academy, the idea of keeping the best of the past and then adding, in a very considered way, new elements that were unashamedly new to make the building work again, to refresh the building. And I think that philosophy has continued throughout all the work that we've done with historic buildings. And you can see here, this is the original plasterwork going back to 1810, the original windows, and then set against that is the new staircase that takes you to the upper level. And we very deliberately kept the new structure away from the historic structure by glazing a strip between the old and the new, so you could see through the glass to the detail of the historic above, the cornice that lay above the new floor. So I think everything was very expressed. And then if we go up to the top space that I just talked about, you can see that strip of glass, and in turn you can see the continuity of the architecture directly below. And then we stripped off the lead of the cornice, and on that we placed some of the plaster casts. These are not originals. The plaster casts that the Royal Academy had made in order that people could do life drawing in the 19th and early 20th century. And then we restored, completely renovated the galleries with proper light control and proper humidity control and air conditioning. And you can see children here enjoying the Calder exhibition, which was one of the earlier exhibitions. And that same philosophy continued through at the British Museum. And you can see the British Museum as it used to look like, with all the galleries, and in the heart of the museum, the British Library built its round reading room, the Great Round Reading Room. And around the round reading room are the buildings that were destroyed in World War II and then rebuilt after the war, of no architectural interest whatsoever, that were attached to the round reading room in a courtyard that disappeared only a few years after it opened. So this was what the courtyard looked like when Smirke, the architect, created the British Museum in the 1820s, 1830s. And it was a garden at the heart of the museum. But his brother, with an Italian librarian, seized this space a few years later and built the round reading room, which was a very interesting structure, and the courtyard was lost to the public forever. And this is how we found it when we entered the competition, which we won in about 1995. And you can see those post-war bookstack buildings. So the strategy was to remove the bookstack buildings, obviously to preserve the round reading room, to give the round reading room a new elevation which it never had, and to restore the courtyard for public use, albeit that we raised the level of it to the level of the museum around it. So it was not a sunken courtyard, it was accessible at the main level. And then we threw over that, because it's London and it rains, we threw over that a very lightweight glass and steel enclosure to keep the rain out, but very much to let the light in. So this is what the site looked like when we started demolition. And it was a very delicate affair because the round reading room, as you can see, the bottom part of it was made really of hardly more than cardboard. It was never designed to be outside. And the brickwork above it was very poor quality, as were the windows. And what was fascinating, and I won't go into too much detail now, but we couldn't gain any access to this site. It was entirely surrounded by the museum, and we'd sworn on day one that we would not allow the museum to shut for one single day during the construction. So everything that you see here had to be lifted out by crane in a skip, and everything that was built thereafter had to be lifted back in again by crane. There was no access at all to the building site. And I'm pleased to say the museum did not close for one single day during the construction. And so here you see the completed courtyard with the round reading room now probably looking as it might have been meant to have looked if it had ever been an outside building, clad in stone. We then took the liberty of wrapping a staircase around it to take you to the principal upper level. And then you move around this. This is a focal point, and you gain access to all the galleries through the great porticos that Smirke designed. And this is the long view looking down the courtyard, the great court, which is open to the public not only during the hours of the museum, but also beyond that. So it's a truly public space. And what is interesting is that the light that is coming through the glass is only about 27% of the light outside. Although this photograph, and when you go there, as I'm sure many of you have been, it feels as if you're out of doors. We've actually reduced the amount of light by 73%. And that's obviously to keep the space cool and not to overheat. And this is very much a public space that is opened to everybody, and all sorts of different activities take place inside it. And then just moving quickly on to another public space, because I think public space is a crucial part of any project. Of course, this is us celebrating getting the Olympics in Trafalgar Square, which has become London's main civic space. And it was all part, and I apologise for the hieroglyphs on the right, but it was all part of a study that got partly implemented of the centre of London that we did back in the 1990s. In particular, looking at Trafalgar Square, and again, I'm sure many of you will remember, it used to be a traffic roundabout. And it was really a centre for pigeons. And as you can see, people were treated like cattle. They were literally put into pens as they tried to cross the road. It was the most hostile pedestrian environment in London. And really nobody got to the centre of the square other than some very hardy tourists who braved crossing the road. And it was very dangerous. People got killed trying to get to the centre of Trafalgar Square. And we did a lot of detailed research with space syntax out of University College about who used the centre, and the answer was no Londoners went anywhere near the centre of Trafalgar Square. They were the pale blue, and it was only these foolhardy tourists who made it to the centre. And it all seems very simple looking back at it. All we did, working with Transport for London, the people who manage the traffic in London, was to take out the traffic in front of the National Gallery. But that had the dramatic effect of linking the sort of surrounding area to the centre of Trafalgar Square, which of course enabled things like the celebration of the Olympics to take place. So now there is a grand terrace which gives the National Gallery a proper setting, gives St Martin's in Fields, the church at the head of the space, a proper setting, and links everybody into the square. So rather than this just being a pigeon paradise, as it was before, now there is a public space with a handsome set of stairs that allow people to move up and down or just sit and enjoy the occasional sun in London. And as you can see from these photographs, this has become the sort of civic space for London, and it's used for all sorts of events. I'm going to touch on one more building and then move on to the Brain Centre. And just to give a sort of balance to this, I don't want you to think that we only deal with historic buildings. A new cultural building, music centre in the north of England, just south of Newcastle, in a place called Gateshead, which is a very unknown place until they commissioned Anthony Gormley to do The Angel of the North. And very cleverly, that completely changed everybody's attitude towards Gateshead, and it became a centre for culture. And they actually seized the initiative from Newcastle. And you can see the site on the right, a wonderful site on the River Tyne, which runs between not quite a gorge, but quite steep banks. And so the views from the site looking towards Newcastle to the north are very dramatic. And the idea here was to take cultural buildings, concert halls, 3 of them, that are very inward-looking spaces, and trying to make them into publicly accessible spaces. And what we designed was a public route and a public concourse that was independent almost of the concert halls themselves, that allowed the building to be used for 18 hours a day. It wasn't just used for cultural events. And that has been quite a success. And you can see the large concert hall, which handles around 1,800 audience, the smaller one on the right, and then the rehearsal hall, which is really the centre for the 4th element, which is a music school, a conservatoire, that exists underneath the concourse, and that's their performance space. But on the concourse, there is a big space in front of the rehearsal hall that is a social space that allows people in the area to come, as you can see here, when there isn't necessarily a performance, and just have a cup of coffee and a croissant, or to have lunch, or to have tea, and just meet their friends there. And it's under shelter, and it enjoys a magnificent view. And it's been a great success as a place where people come together. And in order to get to the school, you have to come to this space and then go down the stairs, or up the stairs to the performance spaces. And here you can see, looking down on that space, you can get a feel for the view with the wonderful 19th century bridges that Newcastle has just outside the new building. And the terraces, and in the summer, the sun coming in from the northeast. And then this is the main concert hall, as I said, with 1,800 people as an audience. Then the seamier, more intimate 400-seater for all sorts of different kinds of performances, concerts in the round, and then the school's hall in the middle. And then below all of that, the conservatoire, which is for the local community and local schools coming together to enjoy learning about music in all its different forms. And then all of this is wrapped in quite a dramatic enclosure, which reflects the sunlight and reflects the whole pattern of clouds as they move over the building. And this is made up of individual panels, all the same, both glass and stainless steel. And as it were, shrink wraps the 3 halls very precisely. It was actually a very economical way of enclosing the space. And I think it shows in detail how important the structure is in relation to the appearance of the building. You know, the economy of the steel is something that we worked very closely with the contractor, who also worked on the enclosure for the British Museum, the same people. And so, just to conclude on, but the most important part of this evening, we were thrilled when we were asked to come to Jerusalem and talk about the possibility of designing the new brain centre for the university. And as I think with all the projects I've just talked about, central to any successful project is the relationship with the client. And I think we've enjoyed an incredibly positive relationship with everybody here at the university. It's been a very creative dialogue. And you can see here just some of the sort of photographs that we've taken during the earlier stages, the way that we work on the left with blocks of coloured foam to explore ideas around a table. A very important way of getting everybody to contribute in the early stages. You all know the university, so I really don't have to talk about that. The site you can see here in the heart of, as it were, the newer part of the site, with amazing views across the valley, and of course behind it or in front of it, the rather beautiful landscape that threads its way through the heart of the campus. And this is the aerial view looking down on the whole of the campus, the site that I'm talking about where the new building will be housed, the whole perimeter of this part of the university, the pedestrian path that wanders through the green landscape, which is so central to the success of the configuration of the campus. Future important points of access from the new light railway, both at the main entrance on the left, but very importantly, just in front of our new building. So that is an important generator of the design. A horizontal glimpse of looking from the landscape across the valley, and this being the site where the cars are currently parked. And so this is the appearance of the building as it will be from that lower level. This is where the tram will run and where the tram stop will be. So we have a building that faces two ways, towards the tram and the access from the lower level, and also at the higher level from the main landscape spine that runs through the university. And those are quite key generators. And although this is a research building, and therefore by definition you might say could be an enclosed building, working very closely with everybody here, we see this to be a very open building, and the ground floor a very public ground floor. And this picks up quite a number of the threads that I've already talked about earlier this evening in all the buildings that we've looked at. And just quickly on a cross-section, you can see that there are two bays or two wings of accommodation, and in the middle a courtyard, which is the social centre of the whole building. And the whole of the ground level is given over to publicly accessible facilities, the art gallery, the auditorium, library, and so on, with the laboratories raised up so that they're more private at the upper levels. And then beneath the building, car parking and other core facilities. So at the heart of the building, an open courtyard with citrus trees running down the spine, with water, a landscape. So it's a pleasant place to meet your friends, to talk and discuss. And then there are balconies where everybody moves at the upper levels that look down into this space. And then at ground level, you move sideways into the auditorium and so on. And you can see the plan here, and I don't intend to go through that in any detail. But then, during the winter, obviously, unlike California or places with even better climates than Jerusalem, there aren't many of those, but in the winter, we do need to close the space down, so there is a very simple sliding roof that will close down for the 3 or 4 winter months. So during the winter, it will act as a protected environment. But once spring comes, then the roof will be opened, and that will remain open probably until October or when autumn is over. And then, as you move up the building, not only is the movement around the sides, but there is also social spaces where, again, students, professors, teachers, researchers can all meet have a cup of coffee and discuss things in a more relaxed and comfortable way. But it's all part of this one single space. So all the movement, all the social spaces, all the common activities are all related to the courtyard. And then off that circulation, you get the laboratory spaces, which are flexible, because again, one never knows what is going to happen next in any kind of research building. And they're served, as you can see, by the fixed cores that are just behind the circulation around the courtyard. And so in this way, we provide a high degree of flexibility, but related to a very strong social concept. And you can see here, moving into the laboratories, again, the opportunity for these to be light and airy and open. And I'll talk about the pattern on the glazing next. And this all goes back to the earliest or the earlier days of research into the brain, when Cajal did his investigations and produced these extraordinary images of the makeup of the brain. And you can see here a whole range of the different, I call them patterns, but then I'm not an expert, that emerged as a result of his research. And we felt there was a very interesting opportunity here of taking those images, those forms, and bringing them together to form the solar screening to the outside of the building. And this would be made out of cast aluminium and would protect the east and west elevations in particular from the sun. So we take these, we develop them a little, and then we repeat those down the length of the elevation. But they're rooted in the original research, the original images that were created. And you can see here, looking at, first of all, some foam mock-ups, and then moving through into the aluminium castings as a prototype that will be forming that external elevation. This is against our office in London. And so this is the impact that will be created so that the image of this building, when it's finished, will very strongly relate back to the earlier days of brain research. And we feel that this is a very appropriate sort of signal for the building on the campus. And this, of course, is looking at the upper level as you approach down the main path that, as I said, makes its way through the landscape, some of it very cultivated and some of it much wilder, as it is on the left in our part of the site, with the valley on the right-hand side, and all of this lifted up with the public facilities sort of glazed and open and visible at the ground floor. And at that level too, there will be a cafe, again, as a meeting space for other departments in the university. And I think I should end there. Thank you.
Thank you. And we would like to give the audience 15 minutes for questions. And Spencer would like to answer.
I'll try.
Yeah. Who would like to be the first? Yes, please.
Thank you for your lecture. Most of your buildings have big spaces with cover of glass. How do your clients, what did your clients say about the temperature, about the climatization, I mean, heating in winter and cooling in summer, especially in Israel, because it wastes, there's a big waste of energy with these spaces.
No, I think, well, I think we take that topic very, very seriously. If I just look at the British Museum as an example, what I didn't say is that in the floor of the British Museum, there is a very traditional Roman technology with underfloor heating for the winter and a little tiny bit of cooling for the summer. But the nature of the space at the British Museum is not an indoor space. It is not trying to be a fully conditioned space. It is an in-between space. So the range of temperature is much more than you would expect within a building, anywhere. And we provide a little bit of heating, which is at its most efficient in the floor level because it heats just the people who are in the space. It doesn't pretend to heat the whole volume. And in the summer, it takes just the top level of temperature off if it's very hot. It isn't used very often, but it does take it. If it's a very hot summer, then it takes a little of the temperature off. But the shading that I talked about, the 73% of solar shading in the glass has a huge impact on that space. It's a naturally ventilated space. Fresh air is brought into the space, and fresh air escapes at the roof level. So it's a very carefully engineered space. Although we think the value of getting light, particularly in northern climates, into buildings is incredibly important, we don't do that in an ad hoc way. It's something that we take deeply seriously. For instance, I didn't talk, but it was shown in the introduction. At Stansted Airport, we introduced roof lights in the airport. It was probably the first airport ever to get rid of the mechanical plant and put it below the floor level to free up the roof so we could get natural light in. And that's unbelievably beneficial in terms of the energy consumption, because instead of having an artificially lit space, we have a naturally lit space, and the airport authority saves something like 500,000 kilowatts of electrical energy per annum compared with a traditional terminal that they ran before. Now, obviously, when it comes to Israel, the situation is very different. The climate here is completely different from London and the British Isles, and you have to respond to that. But the approach in the Brain Centre is very much that we're creating an outdoor space, we're creating shade through the trees in the courtyard during the summer months. In the winter, when we need to enclose the space, yes, we enclose it. But again, this has been very carefully engineered as a strategy in such a way that the space won't overheat or it won't be too cold in the winter months. And again, we've worked with engineers both here and in our office to ensure that won't happen. So I think the use of natural light in any building requires very careful consideration. It's not something you can just do in an ad hoc way. It has to be very carefully considered. But I'm not aware in any of our buildings, and you're right to say that a lot of our buildings do have a lot of natural light, I'm not aware that we've ever had a problem with anybody complaining about overheating or being too cold or whatever, because they've been properly thought through. Yes.
You mentioned earlier that a lot of your previous projects relate to the historical surrounding of the building. And I was wondering about this new building, how does it relate to the existing campus?
Well, that's a very good question. I think the campus, I think it's true that any building has to relate to its surroundings, whether it's a relatively new surroundings or whether it's old surroundings. And the context of any building is critical. I think when you look at the new Brain Centre, one of the things that struck us very strongly about the whole of the campus was it was arranged on a very strong orthogonal rectilinear grid. The central space in the middle, the landscape space, varies quite considerably. Sometimes it's a lawn, sometimes it's the wild trees and the rocks, and it's different widths. It's very organic because it represents the brow, the top of the hill. But then I think in a very convincing way, all the buildings, and this decision was taken back in the 1950s when the original design was done, all the buildings are at right angles to this green spine. And I think it's a very nice diagram. And it's one that we were particularly struck with when we came the first time to see the site. And so very deliberately our building follows that rhythm of buildings set at right angles with the entrance off the green spine. I think it's a very direct response to the history of that particular site. We did look in the early days at radical alternatives where we broke away from that geometry, but it seemed totally wrong. I mean, we stood back, we discussed it with everybody, and although it produced some quite interesting possibilities geometrically, I think that rhythm of the buildings is so strong in the university, I think it's a brave person who breaks it.
Yes, please. With a glass roof, have you ever planned something in case of an earthquake in Israel?
Well, let me just. The roof at the Brain Center is not glass. It's a very thin film, PTF film. So it will not have a problem if there was ever an earthquake in Jerusalem. It's also a remarkably good and is hugely recommended in terms of its relation. If there ever was a fire that broke out and got into the courtyard, this material literally evaporates in a fire and does not cause any smoke or anything that can affect people. So it operates very well in all sorts of different conditions. And also because it moves, it's, I think, more sensible to use something that might not break when you move something. So it scores very highly as a material for this particular instance. At the Great Court, although we do have very minor earthquakes in Britain, very occasionally, they're considered so insignificant in relation to the general loading on the roof. And the glass is all laminated, that I don't think that that's thought to be a risk in London.
In the great courtyard, you have this enormous, wonderful ceiling of glass. Now, in a country like Israel, can you get very special glasses that will cut down the ventilation, the heat loads, air conditioning, aren't they very...
Yes, there's nothing very special actually about that glass. What it is, but what you don't see because you're so far away from the glass, is it's ordinary glass. I mean, it's laminated, so it has a film between two sheets of glass. But I mean, that's, I think, standard the world over. And then baked onto one of those sheets of glass is a enamel pattern of, in the case of the British Museum, dots. You can bake any pattern you like. When we did the Elephant House in Copenhagen, we baked a pattern of leaves on the roof. But the effect is the same, that it's solid material that reduces really the amount of glass that is visible to the sun and to the sky, and therefore cuts down the amount of light, the amount of sunlight, the amount of heating. But that technology is both quite old and I think commonplace. We've never met somewhere where you can't do it. It's a very straightforward procedure. It is just literally baking an enamel pattern onto the surface of the glass. But I think the trick at the Great Court was they're quite small dots, quite closely spaced, and because you're standing, I don't know, whatever it is, 12 meters, 15 meters away, your eye just doesn't see it. It just looks like transparent glass. But when you get close to it, you can actually see the dots. So it's actually a quite basic technology, but it's highly effective.
Last question, please.
Good. People are ashamed.
I always are.
Can you introduce the next
Oh yes.
movie?
So let's move on to the movie, which is I think a very interesting film that will give you an insight into the brain of Norman Foster.
Thank you very much. תודה רבה.